boardroom at the federal contracting office had been quiet that morning, but Rebecca Morrison barely noticed as she signed the final document in a stack of papers, her arthritic mother Helen sitting patiently beside her in the waiting area. The clerk had rushed through the explanation. Something about a routine infrastructure bid her small consulting firm had submitted months ago, but Rebecca's mind was elsewhere, focused on getting her mother home before the approaching blizzard hit. She scrawled her signature across the bottom line, unaware she had just signed a $50 billion government contract that would transform her from a struggling single consultant into one of the most powerful contractors in the nation. Her phone buzzed with a message from Derek, her boyfriend of 3 years, demanding she come to his penthouse immediately, but she was already late. By the time she arrived with Helen, snow already falling in thick sheets, Derek's face was twisted with rage. He'd found out about her morning appointment, but not what it meant. He assumed she'd been wasting time again with her pathetic little business instead of being available for his needs. Before Rebecca could explain, before she could even remove her snow-covered coat, he kicked her and her elderly mother out into the snow, his final words echoing as he slammed the door. "You're nothing, and you'll always be nothing." What Rebecca did next would crush him and leave him devastated in ways he couldn't imagine. But would she use her newfound power for revenge? Or would the weight of $50 billion reveal something darker about the man she'd almost married? And could her mother's quiet wisdom guide her through the storm, both outside and within? The morning of January 15th began like any other disappointing day in Rebecca Morrison's life. But the universe had scripted something extraordinary that she couldn't yet see. She stood in her cramped apartment bathroom, studying her reflection in the cracked mirror. 34 years old, exhausted from working 3 consulting jobs simultaneously, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had become her signature look of survival rather than style. The face staring back at her showed someone who'd forgotten how to dream, but the stack of overdue bills on her kitchen counter reminded her why pragmatism had replaced hope. Her mother, Helen Morrison, sat at the small dining table, carefully sorting pills into a weekly organizer, her 72-year-old hands trembling slightly from the Parkinson's that had been stealing her independence for the past 5 years. Helen had been a university professor once, brilliant, commanding, respected, but now she depended on Rebecca for everything from medication management to basic mobility. Rebecca didn't resent this responsibility, but the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders every morning like a physical burden she couldn't set down. "You have that meeting downtown today," Helen said, her voice still carrying traces of the authority she'd once wielded in lecture halls, but softer now, gentler. "The one about the infrastructure proposal." Rebecca nodded absently while checking her phone, seeing 3 missed calls from Derek and a text message that made her stomach tighten. "Where are you? I need you here. Now." Derek Lancaster had seemed like salvation when they'd met 3 years ago at a networking event. Handsome, successful, confident in ways that Rebecca had never managed to be. He ran a mid-level commercial real estate firm that he constantly implied was more impressive than it actually was. But Rebecca had been too lonely and too tired to examine the discrepancies between his claims and reality. "I almost forgot about that meeting," Rebecca admitted, glancing at the clock. "I submitted that bid 6 months ago. Honestly, I assumed they'd rejected it like all the others." Helen's knowing eyes studied her daughter with the perception that motherhood and decades of teaching had sharpened into something resembling clairvoyance. "Sometimes the things we forget about are the ones that change everything," she said cryptically, but Rebecca was already mentally calculating whether she had time to meet with the contracting office and still make it to Derek's penthouse before his temper escalated beyond texts. The federal contracting office occupied the third floor of a gray government building that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed architectural beauty was a waste of taxpayer money. But the bureaucratic efficiency inside moved with surprising speed. Rebecca helped her mother navigate the elevator, Helen's cane clicking against the tile floor as they made their way to Suite 304, where a clerk named Patricia Chen, no relation to anyone Rebecca knew, waited with an expression that seemed oddly significant for what Rebecca assumed was a rejection meeting. "Ms. Morrison," Patricia said, gesturing to a chair while studying Rebecca with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice. I understand the weather is deteriorating rapidly." Rebecca glanced out the window at the gray sky, already seeing the first snowflakes beginning to fall, but Patricia was pulling out a folder so thick it looked like a manuscript. "Your proposal for the National Infrastructure Modernization Initiative was quite comprehensive," Patricia continued, sliding papers across the desk. "The review committee was particularly impressed with your approach to integrating rural connectivity with urban renewal." "That's kind of you to say," Rebecca responded automatically, prepared for the polite rejection that would follow the compliment. But Patricia was already pointing to signature lines on multiple documents. "The contract value is substantial," Patricia said, her tone matter-of-fact despite the words that followed. $50 billion over 7 years with provisions for extension based on performance metrics. You'll need to sign here, here, and here, then initial these disclosure pages." Rebecca's hand froze halfway to the pen, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. "I'm sorry, did you say 50 billion?" she asked, certain she'd misheard, but Patricia was already nodding while checking her watch. "Yes, though the first-year allocation is only 4 billion, which should give you time to scale your operations appropriately. The payment structure is outlined in Section 7, and you'll have access to federal resources for security clearances and personnel vetting. I apologize for rushing, but I have another appointment in 15 minutes, and the approval deadline is today at 5 p.m. If you need time to review—" "No," Rebecca heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. "I'll sign now." The moment felt surreal, dreamlike, but Rebecca's hand moved across the pages with automatic precision, her signature appearing on line after line, while her brain struggled to catch up with reality. She was signing a $50 billion contract, but it felt no more real than signing a credit card receipt at a grocery store. Patricia witnessed each signature with bureaucratic efficiency, stamping documents and filing copies into folders that would disappear into the vast filing systems of federal record-keeping. Helen sat quietly in the waiting area, but Rebecca caught her mother's reflection in the window, a knowing smile playing at the corners of Helen's mouth, as if she'd expected something exactly like this all along. The entire process took less than 30 minutes, but when Rebecca walked out of Suite 304 with copies of the contract in a slim folder, she was technically one of the most powerful government contractors in the nation, even though she still felt like the same exhausted woman who'd looked in her bathroom mirror that morning. Her phone buzzed insistently as they waited for the elevator, Derek's messages growing more aggressive with each passing minute. "Are you ignoring me?" Followed by, "This is exactly why we have problems," and finally, "If you're not here in an hour, don't bother coming at all." Rebecca felt the familiar anxiety twist in her stomach, the Pavlovian response of someone who'd spent 3 years walking on eggshells around a man whose moods shifted like weather patterns. But Helen placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You don't have to go to him," Helen said quietly, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "Especially not now. Not when everything has changed." But Rebecca had spent 3 years believing Derek was the best she could hope for, that his criticism was actually guidance, that his control was actually care. The knowledge of the contract sat in her mind like information in a foreign language. She could see the words, but couldn't yet comprehend their meaning. "He'll be furious if I don't show up," she said, already knowing she would go, already knowing she would try once again to be whoever Derek needed her to be. The blizzard that weather forecasters had been tracking for days hit the city with sudden ferocity as Rebecca drove her aging Honda toward Derek's penthouse in the financial district. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing, but Rebecca had grown up in Minnesota and knew how to navigate winter's worst moods. Helen sat beside her, silent but present, her stillness somehow more powerful than words could have been. Derek's building rose above the city like a glass monument to wealth that was more aspirational than actual, but Rebecca had learned not to point out the inconsistencies in his lifestyle. The penthouse that was actually a high-floor condo he rented, not owned. The luxury car that was leased, not purchased. The designer clothes that appeared in his closet but disappeared just as quickly, probably returned after being photographed for social media. He'd constructed an elaborate fiction of success, but Rebecca had been too grateful for his attention to question the foundation. The doorman recognized Rebecca and waved her through without the usual phone call to verify, which meant Derek had been expecting her, which meant his anger had been building for hours. Rebecca and Helen made their way to the 32nd floor, snow still clinging to their coats despite their attempts to brush it off in the lobby. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she knocked on Derek's door, not from cold, but from the anticipation of his displeasure, the bracing for whatever cutting remarks he'd prepared during her absence. Derek opened the door with the expression Rebecca had learned to read like a weather map, storm clouds gathering, lightning ready to strike. He was handsome in the way that men who spent hours at the gym and significant money on grooming tended to be, but his attractiveness had become something threatening rather than appealing over the past year. His eyes swept over Rebecca and Helen with barely concealed contempt, lingering on Helen's cane with particular distaste. "You're 3 hours late," he said, his voice controlled but vibrating with suppressed rage. 3 hours, Rebecca. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? Rebecca opened her mouth to explain about the contracting office, about the papers she'd needed to sign, but Derek was already stepping back into his apartment, his body language making it clear they weren't invited inside. "I had a meeting that ran longer than expected," Rebecca said carefully, trying to calibrate her response to diffuse his anger rather than escalate it. "At the Federal Building downtown." "The Federal Building," Derek repeated mockingly, his tone dripping with derision. "Let me guess, another one of your pathetic little business ventures that will go nowhere, just like all the others. Meanwhile, I'm here trying to close actual deals with actual clients, and my girlfriend can't even show up when I need her." The words landed like physical blows, but Rebecca had developed armor against Derek's criticism over the past 3 years, a psychological shield that protected her from the worst of his verbal attacks. What hurt more was the way he looked at Helen, his disgust barely concealed as he took in her trembling hands and the cane she leaned on for support. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said automatically, the apology reflexive after years of conditioning. "The weather is getting worse. Maybe we should talk tomorrow when—" "Tomorrow," Derek interrupted, his laugh harsh and bitter. "There is no tomorrow, Rebecca. I'm done. I'm done with your excuses, your failures, your constant neediness. And I'm especially done with—" He gestured dismissively at Helen, "with having your mother as a permanent third wheel in this relationship." The apartment's warmth spilled out into the hallway, highlighting the contrast between Derek's comfortable space and the cold corridor where Rebecca and Helen stood, still covered in snow, still waiting to be invited into shelter. But Derek made no move to let them in, and Rebecca felt the first stirring of something that might have been anger if she hadn't spent so long suppressing such feelings. "Derek, please," Rebecca tried again, hating the pleading tone in her voice but unable to stop it. "It's a blizzard outside. Can we at least come in and talk about this?" "Talk about what?" Derek demanded, his voice rising now, abandoning the controlled anger for something more volatile. "About how you waste your time on these ridiculous government bids that never go anywhere? About how you drag your mother everywhere because you can't accept that she belongs in a facility where professionals can handle her condition? About how you keep pretending you're going to build some kind of empire when you can barely keep your head above water?" Each word was chosen for maximum damage, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been cataloging Rebecca's vulnerabilities for years, waiting for the right moment to weaponize them. Helen's hand tightened on Rebecca's arm, but she remained silent, her dignity intact even as Derek attempted to strip her of it. "You know what your problem is, Rebecca?" Derek continued, warming to his theme now, his face flushed with the satisfaction of finally speaking thoughts he'd apparently been harboring for months. "You don't know your place. You think you're something special, but you're not. You're a struggling consultant with a dependent mother and delusions of grandeur. I've wasted 3 years trying to mold you into someone worthwhile, but you're just not capable of being what I need." The contract folder felt heavy in Rebecca's bag, the papers inside representing a reality so different from Derek's assessment that she felt dizzy from the cognitive dissonance. She should tell him, she thought. She should explain about the $50 billion, about the fact that her ridiculous government bid had just made her one of the most powerful contractors in the nation. But something held her back. Perhaps pride, perhaps wisdom, perhaps simply the desire to see how deep Derek's cruelty could go. "I think you should leave," Derek said, his tone shifting to something cold and final. "Actually, I know you should leave. This relationship is over, Rebecca. You're nothing and you'll always be nothing. I need someone who can match my success, my ambition, my vision for the future. You're just dead weight dragging me down." The snow outside had intensified, visible through the hallway windows as a wall of white that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Rebecca could hear the wind howling against the building, could feel the temperature dropping as the blizzard reached its peak intensity. "Derek," she said, trying one last time to reach whatever humanity might still exist beneath his anger. "It's dangerous outside. The weather service issued a severe warning. At least let us wait until—" "Get out," Derek said flatly, and then, before Rebecca could process what was happening, he placed his hand on her shoulder and shoved her backward toward the elevator. The push wasn't violent enough to knock her down, but it was forceful enough to make his intention clear. They were not welcome, not even to shelter from the storm. Helen stumbled slightly as Rebecca crashed into her, but Rebecca caught her mother before she could fall, her protective instincts overriding her shock at Derek's physical aggression. "You're kicking us out?" Rebecca asked, disbelief breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "In a blizzard? With my mother?" "You should have thought about that before you wasted my time," Derek responded, already closing his door. "Have a nice life, Rebecca. I hope your pathetic little business ventures work out better than this relationship did." The door slammed with the finality of a gunshot, leaving Rebecca and Helen standing in the hallway, snow still melting on their coats, the sound of Derek's deadbolt sliding into place, echoing in the sudden silence. For a long moment, Rebecca couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at the closed door and try to comprehend what had just happened. Derek had kicked her and her elderly mother out into the snow, had dismissed them like they were less than nothing, had revealed a capacity for cruelty that Rebecca had suspected but never fully witnessed until now. Helen's voice cut through Rebecca's paralysis, gentle but firm. "We should go, sweetheart. The storm isn't going to improve," and standing here won't change what just happened. They made their way back to Rebecca's car in silence, the wind whipping snow into their faces with such force that breathing became difficult. Rebecca helped Helen into the passenger seat, making sure she was secure before climbing behind the wheel, her hands shaking, from cold, from shock, from the delayed reaction of adrenaline finally flooding her system. The contract folder sat in her bag on the back seat, its presence suddenly impossible to ignore. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice breaking slightly on the word, "I signed a $50 billion contract this morning." Helen turned to look at her daughter, and Rebecca saw in her mother's eyes something she'd been missing for years. Not pity, not concern, but fierce pride mixed with something that looked almost like vindication. "I know," Helen said simply. "I knew the moment Patricia told you the contract value. I saw it in your face, the shock, the disbelief, the inability to process information that contradicts everything you've believed about yourself." Rebecca started the car, letting the engine warm while they sat in the parking garage, protected from the worst of the storm by concrete and steel. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Why didn't you tell me to explain to Derek to make him understand what had just happened?" "Because," Helen said with the wisdom of 7 decades and a lifetime of watching people reveal their true natures, "he needed to show you who he really is. Not who you hoped he was, not who he pretended to be when you first met, but who he is at his core. A man who would kick a woman and her elderly mother out into a blizzard is a man who would destroy you slowly if you stayed. The contract didn't change who you are, Rebecca. It only revealed what Derek always believed about you." The words settled over Rebecca like a weight and a release simultaneously. The truth of them undeniable, even though accepting them meant acknowledging that she'd wasted 3 years on a man who'd never valued her at all. She pulled out of the parking garage into the storm, driving slowly through streets that had become nearly impassable, the world reduced to white noise and limited visibility. Her phone buzzed intermittently with messages, but she ignored them, focusing instead on getting herself and her mother home safely. By the time they reached Rebecca's apartment, the city had essentially shut down. Businesses closed, streets empty except for emergency vehicles. Rebecca helped Helen inside, got her settled with tea and warm blankets, then finally allowed herself to look at her phone. 3 missed calls from Patricia at the contracting office, along with a voicemail. "Ms. Morrison, I forgot to mention that news of the contract award will be public tomorrow morning. You might want to prepare for media attention. Also, congratulations, you've just become one of the youngest people to receive a contract of this magnitude. Your proposal was truly exceptional." Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten breakfast that morning believing she was nothing, and opened her laptop. A quick search revealed dozens of news articles already circulating in industry publications. Unknown consultant wins massive infrastructure contract. Morrison Consulting awarded $50 billion federal deal. New player shakes up government contracting world. Her phone began ringing, constantly. Reporters, competitors, former colleagues she hadn't heard from in years. Everyone suddenly interested in the woman Derek had dismissed as pathetic just hours earlier. She didn't answer any of the calls, but instead opened her email and composed a message to her 3 largest current clients, small businesses who'd hired her for basic consulting work because she'd been willing to work for rates that reflected her desperation rather than her value. The email was brief. "Due to new commitments, I will be unable to continue our current consulting arrangements. I'm referring you to 3 excellent consultants who can serve you better than I have. Thank you for your business." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, watching the messages disappear into the digital void. Then she opened a new message and addressed it to Derek, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she considered what to say. She could be cruel, could detail exactly what he'd missed by kicking her out that afternoon. She could be triumphant, could send him the news articles about her contract. She could be vindictive, could enumerate all the ways his treatment of her would haunt him once he realized what he'd lost. But in the end, she wrote only 3 sentences. "You were right that I don't know my place. I've been thinking far too small. Thank you for showing me exactly who you are before I made the mistake of committing further. I wish you well." She hit send and then blocked his number, blocked his email, blocked him on every social media platform where they'd been connected. Within seconds, she could see him trying to call, could see notifications piling up as he attempted to reach her through various channels, could imagine his panic as he realized what had happened. The storm outside continued to rage, but Rebecca felt suddenly, surprisingly calm. The calm that comes from finally seeing clearly after years of fog. Helen emerged from her bedroom, wrapped in her robe, and sat down across from Rebecca at the table. "What are you going to do?" she asked, not needing to specify whether she meant about the contract or about Derek or about the life that had just split cleanly into before and after. "I'm going to build something," Rebecca said, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. "Not to prove Derek wrong, he doesn't matter anymore, but to prove to myself that I was never nothing, that his assessment of me was his limitation, not mine." Over the next 72 hours, while the blizzard trapped the city in snow and ice, Rebecca worked with a focus she'd never experienced before. She hired a lawyer specializing in government contracts, an accountant who understood federal financial reporting, a PR firm that could manage the media attention that was building like a wave preparing to crash. She drafted plans for scaling her one-person operation into a company capable of executing a $50 billion contract over 7 years. She reviewed the contract terms with obsessive attention to detail, highlighting requirements and deadlines, mapping out timelines and milestones. Helen watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, occasionally offering insights from her years in academia that proved surprisingly relevant to Rebecca's new challenges. "Building an empire isn't about the money," Helen said on the second night, when Rebecca was reviewing organizational charts. "It's about creating something that reflects your values and serves a purpose larger than yourself. The money is just a tool." By the 4th day, when the storm had finally passed and the city began digging out from under 3 feet of snow, Rebecca had created the skeleton of what would become Morrison Infrastructure Solutions. She'd hired a chief operating officer with 20 years of experience in federal contracting, a technical director who'd worked on similar projects for larger firms, and a human resources director who could help her build a team capable of delivering on her contract's promises. The media coverage intensified as reporters pieced together the story. Unknown consultant wins massive contract, gets kicked out into blizzard by boyfriend who didn't know her worth, emerges as major new player in government contracting. The narrative was too perfect to ignore, and Rebecca found herself fielding interview requests from major news outlets. She declined most of them, but accepted one, a profile in a business publication that had criticized government contracting inefficiencies for years. The interview took place in a conference room Rebecca had rented in a downtown office building, the same building that housed Derek's commercial real estate firm 3 floors below. Rebecca chose the location deliberately, wanting to face whatever ghosts might linger in spaces where she'd once felt small. The reporter, a woman named Jennifer who'd built a career on investigating government waste, approached the interview with skepticism that gradually transformed into genuine interest as Rebecca explained her vision. "The infrastructure crisis isn't just about roads and bridges," Rebecca explained, articulating thoughts that had been forming since she'd first submitted her proposal 6 months earlier. "It's about connectivity, physical, digital, social. Rural communities are dying. because they lack the infrastructure to support modern businesses. Urban areas are strangling on congestion because their systems were designed for a different era. My proposal addresses both by creating integrated solutions that recognize the interdependence of American spaces. Jennifer's pen moved rapidly across her notepad, but her eyes remained focused on Rebecca's face. And what do you say to critics who argue that someone with your limited experience shouldn't be trusted with this level of responsibility? Rebecca smiled, thinking of Derek's assessment of her as nothing, as dead weight, as pathetic. I say that experience is overrated if it only teaches you to repeat the same mistakes with greater confidence. Fresh perspectives sometimes see solutions that entrenched players have been trained to overlook. Will I make mistakes? Probably. But I won't make the mistakes that come from assuming the current system is the only possible system. The article appeared 2 weeks later with the headline, "The Consultant Who Came In From the Cold: How Rebecca Morrison's Outside Perspective Could Revolutionize Infrastructure." It was fair but favorable, presenting Rebecca as someone who might actually deliver on the promise of her contract, rather than just another contractor extracting federal funds without producing results. Derek saw the article. Rebecca knew this because mutual acquaintances reported his increasingly desperate attempts to reach her, his growing realization of the magnitude of what he'd lost. He'd kicked out a woman worth nothing and watched her become one of the most powerful contractors in the nation within days. The cognitive dissonance must have been crushing, but Rebecca found she didn't take pleasure in his suffering. What she felt instead was a kind of distant pity for someone whose worldview was so narrow that he'd mistaken potential for worthlessness. 3 weeks after that night in the blizzard, Derek showed up at Morrison Infrastructure Solutions' temporary office, somehow having obtained the address despite Rebecca's attempts to maintain privacy during the transition period. Rebecca's new security detail, a requirement for contractors handling sensitive infrastructure projects, informed her of his presence in the lobby, asking whether they should remove him. Rebecca considered her options. She could refuse to see him, could have him escorted out, could maintain the boundary she'd established when she'd blocked his number. But curiosity won out. She wanted to see what he would say, wanted to understand what drove someone to such spectacular miscalculation of another person's worth. Derek looked diminished when he entered her office, his confidence eroded by weeks of watching Rebecca's star rise, while his own limited success became painfully apparent by comparison. He'd always presented himself as the successful one in their relationship, but the contrast between his rented penthouse and her newly leased office space in the city's premier commercial building made the fiction impossible to maintain. "Rebecca," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. "You have 5 minutes," she said, her tone professional but cold. "I'm curious what you could possibly have to say that would make this meeting worthwhile." Derek's face flushed with what might have been shame or might have been anger. With him, emotions always blurred together into a volatile mixture that made predicting his responses impossible. "I made a mistake," he said, the words clearly costing him something to produce. "I didn't understand what you were building, didn't see your potential. If I'd known about the contract—" "Stop," Rebecca interrupted, leaning back in her chair and studying him with the kind of clinical interest a researcher might show examining a specimen. "If you'd known about the contract, what? You would have pretended to value me? You would have faked respect for my mother? You would have treated us like we mattered? The problem isn't that you didn't know about the contract, Derek. The problem is that you kicked a woman and her elderly mother out into a blizzard because you genuinely believed we were worthless. The contract didn't change who I am. It only revealed who you've always been." The words landed like hammer blows, and Derek visibly flinched with each one. "I want another chance," he said. his voice taking on a pleading quality that Rebecca had never heard from him before. I can be different. I can be the partner you need, now that your circumstances have changed. Now that my circumstances have changed, Rebecca repeated, the phrase hanging in the air between them like an accusation. That's exactly the problem. You want access to my success, but you contributed nothing to building it. In fact, you actively worked against it for 3 years, criticizing my ambitions, mocking my proposals, making me feel small so you could feel large by comparison. Derek tried again, his desperation becoming more apparent with each failed approach. We had 3 years together. That has to mean something. I know I wasn't always supportive, but I can change. People change when they have the right motivation. Rebecca stood, signaling that the conversation was approaching its end. You're right that people change when they have the right motivation, but your motivation isn't to become a better person. It's to access resources you want to exploit. I hope you do change, Derek. I hope you learn to value people for who they are rather than what they can provide. But that growth will have to happen without me. She gestured to her security detail, who'd been waiting just outside the office door. Please escort Mr. Lancaster out of the building and add him to the prohibited visitors list. Derek's face cycled through several expressions: shock, anger, humiliation, before settling on something that might have been genuine devastation. You're making a mistake, he said as security moved to flank him. You're going to regret this. Maybe, Rebecca acknowledged, but I'd rather regret leaving you than regret staying with someone who kicked me out into a blizzard. After Derek left, Rebecca sat in her office for a long time, processing what had just happened. She'd expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, satisfied by his obvious regret. Instead, she felt oddly empty. Not sad, exactly, but aware of how much time she'd wasted on someone who'd never deserved it. The contract had given her power, but what she'd done with Derek wasn't revenge. It was simply boundary setting, the act of finally valuing herself enough to refuse access to someone who'd proven he would only cause harm. Helen had been right that night in the car after Derek had kicked them out. He'd needed to show Rebecca who he really was, and she'd needed to see it clearly without the distorting lens of hope or denial. The blizzard had been terrible, but it had also been clarifying, stripping away illusions and revealing truth with brutal efficiency. The weeks that followed became months, and Morrison Infrastructure Solutions grew from a concept into a functioning organization, employing over 200 people. Rebecca proved to be a capable leader, not because she knew everything, but because she knew how to hire people who knew what she didn't. The first year of the contract focused on assessment and planning, cataloging existing infrastructure, identifying critical needs, developing comprehensive solutions that integrated physical and digital systems. Rebecca saw Derek occasionally, unavoidably, in spaces where their professional worlds overlapped. He'd launched a social media campaign attempting to position himself as Rebecca's mentor, claiming credit for her success, suggesting that he'd always believed in her potential. The transparent attempt to rewrite history was pathetic enough that Rebecca didn't bother responding. Silence was more damaging than any rebuttal she could have crafted. Helen's health improved during this period, or perhaps it simply stabilized in ways that were easier to manage now that Rebecca had resources to provide proper care. They moved into a house together, not out of necessity now, but out of choice, both women valuing the other's company more than the privacy separate living would have afforded. Helen became an unofficial advisor to Morrison Infrastructure Solutions, her decades of experience analyzing complex systems proving surprisingly applicable to infrastructure challenges. 18 months after that night in the blizzard, Derek's commercial real estate firm collapsed in a scandal involving falsified financial records and misrepresented property values. The man who'd presented himself as successful was revealed to have been operating a house of cards that finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Rebecca heard about it through industry channels, watched the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and sadness. She could have said, "I told you so," could have pointed out that his downfall was inevitable for someone who valued appearance over substance. But instead, she sent a brief message through a mutual acquaintance. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She meant it sincerely, not because she forgave him for how he'd treated her and her mother, but because genuine hope for his growth felt better than sustained bitterness. The devastation Derek experienced wasn't just professional, it was existential. He'd built his identity on being superior to people like Rebecca, on being the successful one, the ambitious one, the one who would go places. Watching Rebecca succeed while he failed forced him to confront the possibility that his assessment of the world had been fundamentally wrong, that value existed in places he'd been trained not to look, that kicking someone out into a blizzard revealed more about his limitations than their worth. Rebecca heard through the industry grapevine that Derek had left the city, moved somewhere smaller where his reputation hadn't preceded him, taken a job with a firm that would never let him make the kinds of mistakes that had destroyed his company. The man who'd believed he was destined for greatness had discovered instead that he was destined for adequacy, not a tragedy exactly, but a reckoning that must have crushed whatever inflated self-image he'd been protecting. What Rebecca did crushed him and left him devastated, but not through revenge or vindictiveness. The crushing came from his realization of what he'd lost, the devastation from understanding that his own cruelty had cost him access to something rare and valuable. He'd kicked out a woman worth billions and watched her prove that his assessment had been the product of his own limitations rather than objective reality. Epilogue. 5 years after signing the contract that changed her life, Rebecca stood in front of a Senate committee reviewing the progress of the National Infrastructure Modernization Initiative. Morrison Infrastructure Solutions had completed 70% of the initial 7-year contract's deliverables 2 years ahead of schedule, had created over 15,000 jobs in communities that had been economically devastated, had integrated systems in ways that were being studied as potential models for other nations facing similar infrastructure challenges. Senator Martinez, who chaired the committee, studied Rebecca with undisguised admiration. "Ms. Morrison, your company's performance has exceeded every expectation. The question before this committee is whether to award you the contract extension for an additional 5 years and $30 billion. Can you explain why we should have confidence that you'll continue to deliver at this level?" Rebecca thought about that morning 5 years earlier when she'd looked in her bathroom mirror and seen someone who'd forgotten how to dream. She thought about Derek kicking her and her mother out into the snow, certain they were nothing. She thought about Helen's quiet wisdom and unwavering belief. She thought about all the women who'd been dismissed and diminished and told they were less than they were. "Senator, I can't promise perfection," Rebecca said honestly. "What I can promise is that we'll continue to approach these challenges with the same fresh perspective that characterized our initial proposal. We'll continue to hire people who've been overlooked by larger firms, continue to integrate solutions that recognize the complexity of modern American infrastructure needs, continue to measure our success not just by metrics but by real improvements in real communities." The committee approved the extension unanimously. After the hearing, Rebecca found a message on her phone from an unknown number, Derek, somehow having obtained her new contact information. The text said simply, "I saw your testimony. You were always capable of this. I'm sorry I couldn't see it." She stared at the message for a long moment, considering whether to respond, then deleted it without answering. Some apologies come too late, and some revelations matter only to the person experiencing them. Helen was waiting in Rebecca's hotel room, having watched the hearing on C-SPAN, her pride visible in every line of her aging face. "You were magnificent," she said, pulling Rebecca into an embrace that felt like vindication and validation and victory all at once. "We were magnificent," Rebecca corrected. "None of this happens without you." That night, Rebecca stood at her hotel window, looking out at the city where she'd once been kicked into a blizzard, where she'd once believed she was nothing. The snow was falling again, gently this time, beautifully covering the streets in white that looked clean rather than threatening. Somewhere in this city or another one like it, Derek was probably watching news coverage of her success, experiencing whatever complicated emotions came from watching someone you'd dismissed as worthless become something extraordinary. What she'd done had crushed him and left him devastated, but Rebecca found she could finally think about him without anger or bitterness. The crushing came from his own hands, his own choices, his own inability to see value in places his limited vision couldn't reach. The devastation was self-inflicted, the inevitable result of building a worldview on a foundation of fiction rather than fact. Rebecca had been unaware she'd just signed a $50 billion contract when Derek kicked her and her elderly mother out into the snow. But awareness wouldn't have changed who he was or who she became. The contract was just the catalyst that revealed truth about his character, about her worth, about the vast distance between his assessment of her and reality. The woman in the hotel window's reflection looked different from the woman who'd stood in that bathroom mirror 5 years earlier, but Rebecca realized the changes were mostly in her own perception rather than external transformation. She'd always been capable of this success, had always possessed the vision and determination required to execute complex projects at massive scale. What the blizzard had done was strip away the lies she'd believed about herself, the diminishment she'd accepted from someone whose own limitations prevented him from recognizing her value. Helen joined her at the window, and they stood together watching snow fall over a city that had witnessed Rebecca's transformation from nothing to something extraordinary. But Rebecca knew she'd never actually been nothing. She'd just spent too long seeing herself through eyes that were trained to overlook rather than recognize worth. "What are you thinking about?" Helen asked softly. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best thing," Rebecca answered. "If Derek hadn't kicked us out that night, I might still be trying to shrink myself to fit his limited vision of what I could be. The blizzard was terrible, but it was also liberating." Helen nodded, her wisdom affirming what Rebecca had learned through experience. The universe has a way of removing people who can't appreciate what they have so that you can become who you're meant to be. Rebecca thought about this for a long time, watching snow transform the city below into something clean and new, understanding that transformation worked the same way, covering what came before with something better while still acknowledging the foundation beneath. Derek's cruelty had been real, but so was her resilience. His devastation had been inevitable, but so was her success. The story wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition, about finally seeing clearly what had always been true. Tomorrow she would return to Morrison Infrastructure Solutions, would continue building something larger than herself, would employ thousands of people and transform communities, and prove that value existed in places the conventional wisdom was trained to overlook. But tonight she stood with her mother watching snowfall, understanding that the woman Derek had kicked out into the blizzard had always been capable of this, had always possessed the strength and vision and determination required to build an empire. She'd just needed someone cruel enough to force her to see it clearly. The snow continued falling, covering the city in white, and Rebecca finally understood that some storms weren't meant to destroy you. They were meant to reveal who you'd always been beneath the lies you'd believed about yourself. Derek had kicked her out thinking she was nothing, but what he'd actually done was kick her out of a prison she'd been building for herself, one diminishing conversation at a time. What she did crushed him and left him devastated. But the crushing and devastation were self-inflicted, the inevitable result of his own cruelty reflecting back to show him the magnitude of what he'd lost. Rebecca hadn't needed to take revenge. His own actions had been punishment enough, forcing him to watch from a distance as the woman he'd dismissed as worthless became someone extraordinary. And in the end, that was the most powerful thing Rebecca did. She became herself, fully and completely, without apology or diminishment. The $50 billion contract was just the tool that made it impossible to ignore what had always been true, that she'd never been nothing, that her worth had never been determined by Derek's limited ability to recognize it, that the woman kicked out into the snow had always been destined for something far greater than the man who'd closed the door.